You said nothing, but she already knew everything. And the way she leaned closer that night changed everything I thought I could hide. It was supposed to be just another normal visit, the kind I had done countless times before without thinking twice. Walking up the familiar street, passing the same gate, hearing the same faint sounds of daily life from inside the house. Everything looked unchanged from the outside. Even the air felt ordinary, warm with the same late afternoon calm. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt slightly off. Not in a way I could explain. Nothing was different enough to point at. The hallway still carried the soft scent of clean fabric and tea. The clock still ticked in the same steady rhythm. Yet my attention kept catching on small details I usually ignored. And then I saw her, my friend's mom. She was moving through the living room with quiet confidence, like she belonged to every corner of the space without needing to announce it. There was a natural grace in the way she adjusted a cushion on the sofa, the way she turned slightly when she heard my footsteps. She looked up. For a moment, everything else faded into the background. Her expression wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was calm, composed. But there was something in the way her eyes held mine that made me pause longer than I intended. It wasn't a greeting that rushed past. It lingered. "Come in," she said softly, like she already knew I would. I nodded, forcing myself to act normal, stepping further inside. But normal suddenly felt like something I had to perform, not something I naturally was. As I sat down, she moved into the kitchen area. I could hear the faint sound of cups touching porcelain, water running briefly, the soft rhythm of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. A few minutes later, she returned with tea. The room felt warmer somehow. She placed a cup in front of me, her hand steady, her movements unhurried. And just for a second, barely noticeable, her fingers brushed the edge of the cup at the same time mine reached for it. It was nothing, a fraction of contact, but my hand paused midair for a heartbeat longer than it should have. She noticed. I could feel it in the silence that followed. Not judgment, not surprise, just awareness. Her eyes lifted slightly toward mine, not staring, not pressing, simply observing. Like she had caught a detail I hadn't meant to reveal. And instead of breaking the moment or looking away quickly, she held it for just a second longer. Then she smiled. Not a big smile, not playful, something softer, controlled, almost thoughtful. "Drink it before it gets cold," she said gently, turning away as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had, because even after she left the room, I stayed still for a moment longer than necessary, my fingers wrapped around the warm cup, realizing that my heartbeat had changed its rhythm for reasons I couldn't yet admit to myself. And somewhere in the quiet of that ordinary house, I started to feel like I was being noticed in a way I wasn't ready to understand. After that first visit, something subtle changed, not in the house, but in me. I told myself it was nothing, just a normal afternoon, a normal conversation, a normal cup of tea. But my mind kept replaying small fragments I hadn't paid attention to before. The way she had looked at me, the way her silence hadn't felt empty, but aware. Like she was quietly reading something I hadn't spoken out loud. So when I returned again a few days later, I was more careful. Too careful, maybe. The house still felt familiar, but I didn't move through it the same way anymore. I noticed my own posture, my tone, even the way I sat down on the sofa. It was as if I had become aware of being seen in a different way, not watched in a harsh sense, but observed with intent. And she noticed that too. She always did. At first, she didn't say anything. That was the strange part. There were no questions, no comments, no teasing. Just a calm acceptance of my presence, as if she was waiting for something I wasn't ready to say. She walked through the room while speaking to my friend about something casual, her voice steady and normal. But every so often, I caught her eyes shifting toward me, not directly staring, but landing on me briefly, like a thought that keeps returning. It made it hard to relax. At one point, I stood up to adjust my seat, trying to act natural, try not to think. But as I moved, I felt her presence shift behind me. She was passing through the room. Close, not invading, just close enough that I became aware of every step she took. She stopped near the table beside me, pretending to adjust a small decorative item that didn't really need adjusting. Her hand lingered there longer than necessary, and I stood still, pretending I didn't notice. But I did. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was controlled, like neither of us wanted to break something that hadn't been named yet. "Are you comfortable there?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was casual, but it landed differently. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine." She looked at me for a second longer than the question required. Then she gave a small, almost unreadable smile. "Good," she said softly before turning away. But that word stayed with me longer than it should have, because it wasn't just about comfort. It felt like she was checking something else, something deeper I couldn't identify yet. Later, when I sat back down, I realized I was paying attention to everything she did. The way she moved across the room, the way her voice changed slightly depending on who she was speaking to, the way she paused for a fraction of a second before leaving the space. It wasn't attraction I fully understood yet. It was awareness. Mutual, quiet, unspoken awareness. And that was the part that made it uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, but because I could no longer pretend I wasn't noticing her noticing me. It happened on an evening that felt quieter than usual. The house was the same. The lighting was the same. Even the sounds were familiar. A distant TV, faint movement in another room, the soft ticking of time passing without urgency. But between me and her, something had shifted into a different kind of silence. Not comfortable silence. Awaiting silence. I didn't realize how much I was avoiding her until I noticed I was doing it without thinking. When she entered a room, I subtly adjusted my position. When she spoke nearby, I answered shorter than necessary. I wasn't being rude. I was being careful. Too careful. And she noticed that too. She always did. That evening, I was sitting alone in the living room when she walked in. She didn't announce her presence. She never needed to. The soft sound of her footsteps was enough to make the space feel different. She stopped a few steps away from me. Not too close. Not far either. Just enough. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel the air tighten slightly, like something unspoken had finally reached its edge. Then she said it. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You can't hide it from me." The words weren't sharp, but they landed deep. I froze. Not because she sounded angry. She didn't. It was worse in a way. She sounded certain, like she had already solved something I was still trying to deny to myself. I looked up at her slowly. She wasn't smiling anymore, but her expression wasn't cold either. It was steady, observant, patient, like she had all the time in the world for my silence. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. She tilted her head slightly, taking a step closer, not invading my space, but reducing the distance just enough that I became aware of her presence in a more physical way. "You think I don't notice how you change when I'm around?" she asked softly. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. My throat felt dry. She paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. "I see the way you look at me," she continued, quieter now. "And I also see when you try not to." That was the moment everything inside me went still. Because she wasn't guessing. She was describing. There was a difference. I didn't know what to say. My mind tried to find a logical response, a safe answer, something that could reset the moment back to normal. But nothing came. Instead, I just sat there, feeling like the space between us had become smaller without either of us moving. She didn't push further. She didn't smile to soften it. She just stayed there, letting the silence do what words couldn't. After a few seconds, she exhaled quietly, almost like she had finally said something she had been holding back for a while. Then she turned slightly, as if giving me space to respond without pressure. But the truth was, I didn't feel pressured. I felt exposed, not in a painful way, in a way that made it impossible to pretend I hadn't been seen at all. After that evening, I thought distance would fix everything. That was my mistake. Not because anything was openly said again, but because silence started to feel heavier than conversation. I began adjusting my behavior more deliberately. Shorter visits, fewer words, less eye contact. I told myself it was normal. Just respect. Just boundaries. Just control. But control only works when both sides aren't paying attention. And she was always paying attention. When I entered the house again, I could feel it immediately. The same familiar environment, but a different emotional temperature. Nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt slightly more defined, like the space itself had become aware of what was happening between us. She greeted me the same way she always did. Calm, soft, unshaken. But I noticed something new in her timing, a slight pause before she spoke, as if she was measuring how I would respond before I even said anything. I tried to keep my distance. I really did. I chose a seat farther away than usual. I kept my hands busy with my phone. I answered questions with careful neutrality. I even avoided looking in her direction unless absolutely necessary. But avoidance creates its own kind of attention. At some point, she walked into the living room carrying a plate of snacks. The sound of the ceramic against her fingers was soft, deliberate. She placed the plate on the table between us. Not too close to me, not too far either. Exactly in the middle. A neutral space that didn't feel neutral at all. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she stayed standing for a moment, her eyes briefly scanning the room. Then she lowered herself onto the sofa, not opposite me, but slightly angled. Close enough that her presence became impossible to ignore. But she didn't speak. That was the most unsettling part. The silence wasn't empty, it was structured. Like she had decided that words weren't necessary anymore. I shifted slightly, pretending to focus on something else. But I could feel her awareness of every small movement I made. At one point, I reached for a snack without thinking. Our hands nearly met over the plate. Not fully, just close enough that the air between our fingers felt charged. I pulled back too quickly. She didn't react outwardly, but I noticed the smallest change, a brief stillness in her expression, like she registered the moment without needing to comment on it. Then she said, almost casually, "You're quieter than before." It wasn't a question. I hesitated. Just tired, I guess. She nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer without actually believing it. But then she added something softer, almost under her breath. Or careful. That single word made my chest tighten slightly. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked down at my hands, realizing I was no longer just trying to avoid her. I was trying to avoid what I felt when she was near. And the worst part, even distance wasn't working anymore. Because no matter where I sat, no matter how little I spoke, her presence still reached me. Not loudly, not forcefully, but steadily, like something that had already found its way in, whether I acknowledged it or not. It was late in the evening when things finally stopped feeling controlled. The house had quieted down in a different way this time. Not the usual peaceful silence, but a deeper stillness that made every small sound feel meaningful. The faint hum of a distant fan, the soft shifting of fabric when someone moved in another room, the slow passing of time that felt heavier than usual. I didn't plan to stay long that day. I told myself it would be a short visit. In and out. No necessary moments. No overthinking. But she was already there when I arrived, sitting in the living room like she had been expecting the day to unfold exactly this way. She looked different, not in appearance, but in energy. Less guarded than before, less structured, like something inside her had loosened slightly. And that made everything more dangerous. We didn't immediately talk. There was no greeting that carried emotional weight, no forced politeness, just a quiet acknowledgement of presence. I sat down, keeping the same distance I had been trying to maintain for days now. It didn't work, because she didn't stay where she was. After a few moments of silence, she stood up and moved closer, not quickly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if the space between us had stopped being something she needed permission to cross. She stopped beside the sofa. Then, slowly, she sat down next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence beside my arm. Not touching yet, just near. She didn't look at me immediately. Instead, she looked forward, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she spoke. "You think I don't see how careful you've become around me," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was softer than before, almost tired in a way I hadn't heard from her. I didn't answer, because I couldn't. She finally turned her head toward me. Her eyes weren't playful anymore. They were steady, but something behind them felt unguarded. "I didn't mean to make you like this," she added. That sentence changed something in the air. For the first time, it didn't feel like she was observing me. It felt like she was feeling the situation too. There was a pause, a long one. Then she leaned slightly closer, not invading, not forcing, just closing the gap enough that her shoulder gently brushed against mine. The contact was light, but it stayed. Neither of us moved away. That was the moment I realized something had shifted, not outwardly, but internally. The distance I'd been holding on to wasn't protecting me anymore. It was just delaying something that was already happening. She finally exhaled, slower this time, and lowered her gaze for a moment. "I don't know what this is becoming," she said quietly, almost like she was admitting it to herself more than to me. Her words weren't a confession of love or intention. There was something more fragile than that. Uncertainty. Human uncertainty. And for the first time, I saw her not as someone who always understood everything before it happened, but as someone standing in the middle of something she didn't fully control either. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was shared, and in that shared silence, neither of us pulled away. After that night, nothing between us returned to how it was before, but it also didn't explode into something dramatic. Instead, it settled into something far more unsettling, quiet understanding without clarity. The kind of emotional space where nothing is officially said, yet everything is already felt. I stopped trying to avoid her as aggressively, but I also stopped pretending I was unaffected. Every interaction now carried awareness, not tension like before, but recognition. Like both of us had crossed an invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed, even if we never defined it. When I visited again, the atmosphere felt softer. Not lighter, softer. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, moving slowly, almost absent-mindedly. The sound of water running, the faint clink of a cup being placed down, the natural rhythm of someone who is physically present but mentally elsewhere. When she saw me, she didn't pause like before. She simply nodded slightly, a small, calm acknowledgement. "Come in," she said gently, without looking too closely at my face. I followed the familiar path into the living room, but I didn't sit far this time. Not because I planned to get closer, but because the need to maintain distance had started to feel unnecessary. A few minutes later, she joined me. This time, she didn't sit opposite me or at an angle of avoidance. She sat beside me, close enough that the space between us felt intentional. But still, she didn't touch me. At first, we talked about small things, ordinary things, nothing meaningful on the surface, but the pauses between sentences carried more weight than the words themselves. At one point, she turned slightly toward me while speaking. Her voice softened mid-sentence, then faded into silence before finishing the thought. She wasn't distracted. She was deciding not to continue. And then she just looked at me, longer than usual, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. Her expression was calm, but there was something vulnerable behind it now. Not uncertainty in the external sense, but emotional openness, like she had stopped hiding whatever she normally kept contained. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, she lifted her hand. It didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable. Her fingers gently reached for my wrist, not gripping, not pulling, just resting there with a quiet steadiness, like she was grounding herself as much as she was grounding me. The touch was light, but it carried weight. And I didn't move away. That was the real moment. Not the touch itself, but my decision to stay still. Her thumb moved once, softly, almost unconsciously, over my skin. It wasn't an act of intention. It was instinct. Something human. Something unguarded. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything we had been avoiding naming. She lowered her gaze briefly, then spoke in a quieter tone. "We don't have to explain everything," she said softly. Not as a confession, not as a declaration, but as acceptance of something already understood. I didn't respond, because anything I could have said would have broken the delicate balance of that moment. So we stayed like that. No distance, no urgency, no clarity. Just presence. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like truth that didn't need words to exist. After that moment, something quietly changed between us, not in a sudden way, not in a way that could be pointed out or explained, but in the way silence itself began to feel different. It no longer carried tension. It carried understanding. Days passed, and I stopped searching for meaning in every interaction. She did too. Whatever had been building between us didn't disappear. It simply stopped demanding attention all the time. Instead, it became something that existed quietly in the background, acknowledged but not constantly examined. When I visited again, the atmosphere felt normal in a new way. Not the old normal, a more honest one. She greeted me the same as always, calm and composed, but there was no longer that invisible distance she used to maintain. No testing silence. No careful observation hiding behind routine gestures. Just presence. I noticed small things first. The way she didn't step back when we passed each other in the hallway. The way her voice stayed steady without overthinking every word. The way she didn't interrupt silence anymore just to fill it. And I realized I had changed too. I wasn't measuring myself constantly anymore. I wasn't watching my tone or my posture or my reactions. I was just there. That evening, we ended up in the living room again. No planned conversation. No emotional weight waiting to be resolved. Just time passing naturally. The light outside had softened, filtering through the curtains in warm, fading tones. The room felt quiet in a comforting way. Not empty, just settled. She sat down first this time, and I followed without hesitation. There was a pause between us, but it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt like space we didn't need to fill. After a while, she leaned slightly back into the sofa, her shoulder gently brushing against mine. A small contact. No reaction needed. I didn't overthink it. Neither did she. A few seconds later, her head tilted slightly, slow, unforced, and came to rest lightly near my shoulder. Not fully leaning in a dramatic way, just enough to show comfort. Enough to show trust in the silence we had reached. I stayed still, not because I was unsure, because I understood that moving would break something that didn't need to be broken. Her breathing was steady beside me, calm, real, human, and for the first time, there was no question in my mind about what this was or what it meant. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was acceptance of something quietly existing between two people who no longer needed to define every feeling to make it real. She spoke softly after a long silence. "Some things don't need to be rushed," she said. Her voice was calm, almost reflective. I nodded slightly, not as agreement, as understanding. The evening continued like that, not with dramatic moments, not with emotional declarations, but with a shared stillness that felt more meaningful than anything we had said before. Her hand rested near mine on the sofa, not holding, just close enough that distance no longer mattered. And as the night deepened, I realized the story between us was no longer about tension or confusion. It had become something simpler, something warmer, something quietly steady, like two people finally learning how to exist in the same space without fear of what it meant anymore.